when we did the Q&A, I'm gonna kind of get a microphone over there, get a microphone over there, and try and
Okay, welcome everybody to the second session. Please take your seats. I'd like to apologize for ringing bells at you. I am sorry. I know it creates a vibe of being back at school. Maybe that's not such a bad thing for the RISE conference, but we really want to maximize the time we have to hear from the people that are coming to speak to us and to get Q&A, and so we don't want to lose time trying to herd cats. So apologies. So this is the second of our sessions on teachers, and it connects to one of the messages that came out of RISE, which was about the importance of supporting teaching. But we already heard about that in the first session, which was the need to think carefully about teacher careers and how that might interact with teacher motivation. We're now going to move on to think more explicitly about supporting teaching through teacher training. And we're going to hear from three papers about teacher training. We're going to hear from, the order has changed slightly from on the program. We're going to hear first from Salman, who's going to talk to us about training for leadership. Then we're going to hear from Paul, who's going to tell us, Paul Glewwe, who's going to tell us about training of teachers themselves. And then we're going to hear from Lindsay, who's going to think about diagnosing a diagnostic tool for studying the teacher management system in general. I'm going to see contrasting results in terms of positive impacts versus null impacts. Then we have a paper from James, where is James? At the back there, which we have to confess is not on the subject of teachers or training. You may have spotted that from the title, but we loved it and we wanted to get it on, and it's in this session. I can't really do anything other than that. But so we will take questions on all four papers at the end, but bear that in mind. Okay, straight over to Salman. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Claire. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be back in this room, and thank you for the opportunity to present this work. This is joint work with Stefan, Dercon, and Donna. Donna is in the room, and Ravinder, Casley, Gera at the World Bank. So I think this is something which you all are very familiar with in terms of like the role of school leadership in the quality of schooling. So this paper is set in a particular context. So I will give you a little bit of background on the contextual side. So we are looking at the school leadership program in sub-Saharan Africa in a very small country, Malawi, which has a set of issues since it introduced free primary education in 1994. So the education system expanded, and then the system is catching up. And we know that the school leadership from the literature plays a central role in improving outcomes through multiple channels. But most of the evidence is coming from the middle income and the high income countries in terms of like better allocation of resources, innovations in pedagogical techniques, and the head teachers can do a lot in order to improve the school climate and enable a learning environment for the children to do better. So, but there are mixed results, even in the high and the middle income country, ranging from very small effect sizes to about 0.425, which is the highest standard deviation effect on the test scores. So I think there are 3 points that I want to make about the Malawian context, which will guide this presentation. Number one is that there are unresolved issues. So it's very difficult to move the needle in the context where structurally the system hasn't caught up with the enrollment. I think Lance's work was there that schooling without learning. So there's a need to do some work on enrollment without schooling. So which is basically you have enrolled the kids before the schools have arrived on the scene. So you don't have the classrooms and the teachers. So you can see that in terms of the outcomes, no matter which test instrument you look at, about 25% of the students are meeting minimum proficiency in terms of like student achievement. One of the tests that is included is the one that we will be using, which is a Malawi longitudinal school survey, which measures kind of like outcomes at the standard 4 level. So what is happening in Malawi, that the resource distribution is very poor. So 20-25% of the schools basically sit on all the resources. So 80% have very fewer resources. But within the schools itself, there's a problem of inefficiencies and distortions where the teachers are not using what is available to them at the school level. So what we are trying to do here, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. So this is the education production function, and you have the classrooms and teachers and the student test scores. So what we are doing through a large scale program in Malawi is to both tackle the binding constraints to learning overall at the system level, and then to have specific intervention, i.e. the school leadership training program, in order to improve the efficiency of resource use. So you want to try to move the frontier, given that the resources, that Malawi's GDP is so low that it will never have the resources that it needs in order to provide the PTRs and the PCRs equivalent to the OECD countries. So in the meantime, what it needs to do is to resource utilization at the school level need to improve. So that will be movement to the frontier. Now there are two ways of moving the frontier itself. One is to invest more in terms of like improve the distribution of the teachers. So that's basically the overall education system can be moved, but that's not like amenable to like a randomized control trial. And we have a paper on that, on moving the education system through targeted kind of like set of reforms to bridge the gap. And we are seeing like convergence taking place. But for today's paper, the presentation is going to focus on moving to the frontier and also trying something on the school culture side in order to move the frontier without more monetary resources, but by kind of like inculcating a school culture that enables learning. So what is the intervention here? That is also important, that the context matters in terms of the implementation of these trainings. So when we look at like different interventions that have been tested out on the training programs, the impacts are quite heterogeneous. And the reason for that is how you motivate the intervention. So in this context, I think we relied on the head teachers focus group discussions in order to identify the weaknesses in the system. And we also used like descriptive data, which was collected, which sets the baseline for this intervention as well. The Malawi longitudinal survey, the first round of that data, that gave us information in terms of what are the binding constraints that the head teachers face. So head teacher is just assigned to be a head teacher one day without knowing the TORs, what it means to be a head teacher. So in that particular context, when you turn up to the job, what is the expectation? So there is no expectation except for the fact that you are doing some record bookkeeping on day-to-day basis, but you are not engaging in the issues and trying to address those issues at the school level. So the standard training kind of like responds to those issues of inefficiencies that are there that can easily be addressed by the head teacher. For instance, like assigning the teachers to lower grade classes instead of like those being stacked up at the upper primary level. Or the textbooks. Textbooks sit in kind of like storerooms and they are not brought into the classrooms at times. So it's not the shortage of the textbooks, it's the utilization of the textbooks that is an issue that creates inefficiency. And then overall, an environment like if there is peer-to-peer bullying, students cannot ask questions, and the treatment of overage girls within the system is kind of like biased, that will create kind of like an environment where the test scores come down. Key thing to note is that standard 4 classroom in Malawi is more or less a multi-level classroom. 20% of the class cannot do 7-4, but is sitting in standard 4. So when you have that kind of heterogeneity within the classroom, the interventions on average are not likely to yield very, very significant impact. So that's also, when we discuss the results, something to bear in mind. So the longitudinal school survey, I think that's the central piece of like identifying the constraints to learning within Malawi. Because previously the lens through which we look at these issues is just the education management information system data, and that does not give us the nuance. So the classic example is like using a 1990 camera to take a snapshot, and then you ask for precision in terms of where to target the resources. That's not going to happen because you're using an old tool in order to address kind of like a problem of resource targeting. So the more nuanced the tools are in terms of collecting the data, and you have like better measurement on the outcome variables, you're going to be able to target resources better. So standard randomized control trial for the school leadership program. There are 2 cohorts. The second cohort is added when we, again, identifying like the weaknesses in the system through the data that were not noted in the first round of the intervention. So the first round of intervention is administered to 800 schools. So it's an intensive training program with 10 days of classroom training, and then going back to the schools, giving them refresher training and seeing if they are adopting the behaviors that are taught in that training program. Then there is an augmented intervention, which basically looks at areas which are not previously covered, which is basically the attitude towards the mindsets, towards girl students, towards overage students in the classroom, and peer-to-peer bullying issues. So basically giving them videos of like what good teachers are doing in terms of positive behavior and how they can inculcate that kind of culture in the school setting. So randomization. Okay. So I think on the identification, because this is a longitudinal sample, so the key concern will be that how many students we are able to track. So there is no differential attrition between the 2 groups, between the treatment and the control groups. 80% of the teachers are tracked, and 85% of the students are tracked on average at the school level. So impact of this standard intervention. So our hypothesis is that it will basically reduce like the repetition rate and improve the test scores. We see improvements in the repetition rate only at the lower primary level, which is significant. We have kind of like done the multiple hypothesis testing correction for the standard errors. On the test scores, about like 0.1 standard deviation improvement, which is kind of like the ball range that we see in the training interventions, more so in the math scores and less so on the English scores. But there is heterogeneity in terms of these treatment effects. So if I cut the data on the class sizes, so class size is an important predictor. So if you're teaching them at 150 class size and you're doing a leadership training program, it's not going to have an impact. That is quite intuitive. So the lower the class sizes, you can see that the higher the impacts even on the English scores. Again, the baseline scores also matter. So if you have student population which is highly disadvantaged, head teacher training is not going to lead you to kind of like resolve those issues. So what are the mechanisms through which these changes are taking place? So we had like the modules related to the theoretical framework on the resource utilization, teacher management, teacher effort, practices. All these are in indices form. We don't see any impact, only on the tangible mechanism, like where we said that you're teaching very few hours to the Malawian kid, like 2.5 hours of teaching. So that message kind of like resulted in concrete changes in terms of like how they approach the remedial classes. So you see the remedial classes kind of like 20% improvements. Just a caveat there that teacher management and resource utilization are positively improving, but they are not significant. So again, you need like 20% improvement in order, 20 to 30% improvement with the sample sizes and power in order for it to be statistically significant. So it's not very easy to kind of like decode the channel here. Then breaking down the remedial classes, both the share of grades that they do the remedial classes and the frequency of the remedial classes, both have gone up as a result of the intervention. Augmented intervention, the dosage that we gave, showed them the videos in terms of improving the behaviors. That didn't seem to have an impact on the mindsets or the belief shift. So our hypothesis is that it was a too low dosage, that like one-off session showing them that, and also the timing of it, that it came right when COVID started. So they were pulled in many different directions after they had gone back to school. The details of these indices are there in the paper, and Donna is also here, so she can also talk about the indices, how they are constructed. So what is the takeaway from this paper? I think two takeaways. One is the descriptive work is very important in education systems research. If we want to take implementation seriously, we need to have like very rigorous parameters of collection of data and in terms of the quality and reliability of the data. So most of the data that we use in sub-Saharan Africa from the education systems is noisy, and it is difficult to have like very precise interventions developed. The second thing is in terms of like the head teacher leadership program helped in the catch-up story in terms of like the students which were at the bottom benefited the most, but you need to have like an environment, you need to have a classroom and a teacher there before those effects can kind of like come into play. We are surprised to see no impacts because bullying was an issue that was identified, and the beliefs of students and all the focus group discussions pointed out in that direction. And I think the team, the authors will learn a little bit in terms of like from the audience that why elicitation of the beliefs is not showing an impact. Thanks a lot.
Oh.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Glewwe, and let me just see if this is going to work. Okay, great. All right. So I think the previous presentation by Salman was maybe an optimistic story. So with some balance here, we have a very pessimistic story, as you can see from the title, about what can we learn from an unsuccessful teacher program, in the case of Nepal. I've been to many RISE conferences, usually presenting on Vietnam, but this is a different thing that we've been working on. And my two co-authors, Julie Schaffner at Tufts University and Uttam Sharma, a former student of mine who's now works in Nepal. Okay. So just a brief overview of what we do in the paper. We have RCT for kind of a standard in-service teacher training program, where the teachers like leave their schools and come to these training centers and spend 2 weeks learning all these things. We're looking at math and science teachers in grades 9 and 10. We collected a lot of data here. You can see the bullet points there. I won't read them off for you, but it's very useful because, as you see in the bottom bullet, this program had no effect. Okay, in fact, the only thing significant was negative. And so this is almost like an autopsy. When the patient dies, what killed the patient? Maybe we'd like to figure that out so we don't kill some more. So that kind of gives you an overview, but let me go into a little bit about this. It's an RCT. So we were supposed to have 204 schools, but there was one area where we're going to pick 4 schools, but they only had 3 schools. So we have 203. These in Nepal, the schools are kind of like in some other countries in South Asia, they go from 1 through 10, grades 1 through 10 or 1 through 12. So they don't really separate so much between primary and secondary. So these 203 schools, we randomly assigned 102, almost half of them, to a treatment. And we had 2 versions of it. And then the other 101 are controls. Okay. And the 2 versions of treatment, I'll talk mostly about the first one. The second one, we added a kind of video assignment or video assessment where we asked the teachers to take videos of themselves doing what they were trained to do. It turned out that the difference between these two was very small, not significant at all. So we just kind of lumped them together because the sample size is not as large as we'd like. Okay. We did this. This was pretty much a nationwide representative sample. There were a few districts that were remote and one that was sort of politically unstable that we didn't go to. But we were able to randomly pick 16 districts out of 65 of Nepal's 77 districts. I'll show you a map in a second. And 2/3 of these schools that we picked were ones that hadn't had much training at all in the previous training program that was done like 5 years earlier. Okay, so here's the map. You can see in red the 16 districts, which we randomly picked from out of those 65. They're spread throughout the country. The ones that are really remote and mountainous were not really in this. We just couldn't get to them. But it's close to representative. I think 95% of the schools in Nepal were in our randomization. Okay, I'm kind of going fast here because I can see a timer looking at me right there. Okay, this picture kind of shows you the obvious thing where we have the 203 study schools. We broke them up into 102 that got what we call phase 1, which is the program. Phase 2, 101, those are the control group, because that was going to happen later, so we could use them as control group. And then for the 102 schools that were in the program, we kind of divide them up with and without this video assignment, this VA, and it really didn't make any difference. So everything I'm going to show you today is we're just combining those two programs together. Okay, this slide just shows you a little bit about the sample design. Why did we pick this? Well, we had like everybody, we had a budget limit, so we couldn't really get as many schools as we wanted to, but this seemed to be a good size to get at, an impact of 0.2 standard deviations. As you'll see later, we can actually say very clearly that we did not get 0.2 standard deviations. And the bottom bullet there is just saying that those ones that had the video assignment, they were pretty much the same as the other ones, so we're just going to lump them together. Okay, so what is exactly that we're doing? So this is pretty much a standard old school teacher training program, which if you look at what people have written up, I'm thinking of Dave Evans and other people, they pretty much say these don't work very well, okay? But why do they don't work? We'll talk, that's sort of a part of the contribution here. But so they had these ETCs, these education training centers, where the teachers would come for 10 days of training. We're talking about grade 9 and 10 math and science teachers here. And what are they being trained in anyways? They're basically trying to teach them to use more active demonstration type teaching methods. For example, for the math teachers, they will like to teach trigonometry. They'd say, okay, there's a tree over there. It's this, measure the angle here between the base of the tree and the top of the tree. And we're standing this far away. How tall is the tree? That's one kind of demonstration thing. Where they would go to a local bank and ask them what the interest rates, have the kids ask the bank people what the interest rate is, and they do some math problems with that interest rate. So they tried to make this more interactive and more demonstrations. And for science, they would bring in like plants when they're talking about plant thing, a plant in a pot, I guess. And there was another thing that was kind of interesting, like to teach astronomy. They would take an umbrella and paint like the stars and whatever else is up in the sky there on the umbrella. And part of this was like also mentioned, you're using local materials, trying to like have the teachers have these physical objects to show the class to make it more interesting. Okay, so that probably sounds like a good idea. Maybe some people disagree with that. We'll see. Anyways, so the NCED, the National Center for Education Development, is in charge of the training teachers in Nepal. Actually, they've now completely changed the structure, so I'm not even sure that it exists anymore. But during this time, that's who did it. The teachers were, in theory, kind of held accountable in the sense that they were graded on whether they actually showed up for the training and whether they participated. And in terms of, they're getting a promotion to the next level of teaching, this would help count for that. Okay. All right. Okay, so we collected a lot of data, both qualitative and quantitative data here. And we think it worked pretty well. mean, this slide just shows you that, yeah, the qualitative data, which me as and many of you as economists were not really trained to work with, help us to actually design our questionnaires and also understand like what happened here. Why did this not work very well? So we advise it. One of the things that really worked well is that we interviewed most of the teachers that were trained and most of the trainers who were training them by phone. It was very cheap. We just got the phone numbers and called them up. So that turned out to be a very nice thing to understand what's going on. So that's the last bullet there. Okay. Okay. So just to kind of, the test that we use, since these are math and science teachers, we tested kids both at baseline when they were in grades 8 and 9 and at end line at the end of grades 9 and 10 for their math and science skills. And we had some questions in the test that focused on exactly what the teacher training was about and other ones that were more general. And because we knew that the students weren't so good in many ways, many of the students, we asked some questions that were way below the grade 9 and grade 10 curriculum. Okay. And in terms of implementation, here's another lesson. The baseline tests, we just asked local people to design them. It didn't work out very well. So for the end line test, we brought in some sort of international people to work with the local people, and that seemed to have worked a lot better. Okay. All right, so that's about the assessments. That's our outcome that we're looking at. In terms of measuring teacher practices to see whether they really change them or not, we first had some classroom observations using the Stallings method, which if I were doing it today, I probably wouldn't use it, but Barbara can tell us the new latest thing with teacher observations. And then we asked the teachers themselves to do what did you do, how do you teach and stuff like that. Then we also asked the head teachers, the school principals, and the students themselves, like tell us like what the teachers were doing. So we have lots of data on what the teachers were doing. Okay. And then we also measured teachers' subject knowledge of math and science because we want to know if they actually learned, because part of the training is not just to make you a better teacher, but it makes sure you actually know the math and science you're supposed to be teaching. And it's very, very touchy, to like ask teachers to take tests, because they're worried that they might get punished or something if they don't do well on the tests. And in Nepal, like many countries, has a strong teachers union. So how could we really test the teachers? We didn't think after talking to people that they'd be willing to take a test and like have their name assigned to the test. So we kind of did two things. First of all, we gave this teachers this what effectively was a test, but they didn't have to write their names. Okay, so we have a school with some math and science teachers, and maybe if one did bad, they say, okay, that wasn't me, that was the other person, maybe. So you can't really hold them accountable. But secondly, we didn't really say we're testing you. We said, okay, we're testing the kids. And so here are the questions that we're asking. Here are some of the questions on the test of the kids. And we want you to tell us if you think this is a good test question or not. So we say, like, what do you think? Is this a fair one to ask the kids? And then the key one is we said, what do you think the test designer was thinking as the correct answer for this question? So we're basically supposed to say, what's the correct answer for this question? And so that's what we focus on, what they said. Okay. All right. So, and then we also had sort of evaluations of how this thing was implemented. As I mentioned before, we had these phone calls about, with the teachers and this, and actually the education training centers, we called them, not we, because I don't speak Nepalese, but we had people in our group sort of call them and ask them what's going on. Did the teachers show up? Is it starting on time and things like this? So we have a lot of things on this. And sometimes it was hard to get information about what was really happening in these education training centers. So we had to call some of these people up multiple times. Okay, but it wasn't very expensive to make those phone calls. Okay, so here's sort of like the punchline, or the first punchline, which is that this program did not work. So these are the test scores in math and science in grades 8 and grade 9. You can see that, so the first column is the numbers. You can see 3 out of 4 are negative. None of them are significantly positive. In fact, 2 of the negative ones are significant at the 10% level, but not at the 5% level. So this program really did not work very well, despite a lot of hopes on a lot of people. So we can rule out. You see in the final column here, the 95% confidence interval. So for 3 out of the 4 tests, we can rule out an effect of 0.1 standard deviations or higher. So this clearly was not very successful. Okay, so then the question is like, why? What happened? What went wrong? I think I've already suggested a few things. So we basically, so before I get to what went wrong, we do some other things. Like we focus just on the questions in the exam that were focused on what the training was like, the SSDP training. We also look only at, let's see. Yeah, we looked at a set of teachers that didn't have the previous training because, okay, maybe the reason it didn't have a big effect because a lot of the teachers were trained 5 years ago. But so we looked at the ones who weren't trained 5 years ago. Doesn't matter. We do local average treatment effects because a lot of the teachers actually didn't show up for the training. So that's like measuring the effect on the teachers who did show up. Nothing significant. Okay, it's just didn't work no matter what we tried to do. Okay, so why did it fail? We can go through in the last 2 minutes here these 5 things that sort of went wrong. Okay, so the first thing that go wrong was really obvious. Half the teachers didn't show up for the training. Okay, they were it was optional. They weren't required to do it. Okay, so why did they not? We actually asked some of them, like, what is your experience in past training? And they had a lot of negative things to say about the past training. Okay, some of the reasons they didn't show up is because, actually, what I mean they didn't show up is, at end line, a lot of the teachers had not been trained. Okay, part of it is due to the fact that there's a lot of teacher turnover. So at end line, maybe 20% of the teachers are new ones, and so they wouldn't have been around for the training in the first place. But most of them, they were around for it, and they didn't apply. They didn't attend. Okay, one of the reasons why this happened is that the training took place when the schools were in session. Okay, so basically what it means is that your math and science teacher is pulled out for 2 weeks. So a lot of this the school principals, the head teachers would say, no, I'm not letting my teacher go to that. Okay, so that didn't work out very well. But this isn't the entire explanation, because even when we control for, we just look at the ones who did get the training, it's still no significant effect. So it's a problem, but it's not the only problem. Okay, weak governance of the ETC centers. We find that the trainers didn't get a lot of preparation for this. They weren't really trained for it. They were just given some materials and didn't have much time to look at them. Some of them never got the materials. They didn't have much time. And some of the teachers said, yeah, that they didn't show up or they were not knowledgeable. Okay. But it's not the only reason, because a lot of the teachers said it was pretty good. At least half of it was good. Okay. A third thing, mismatch between trainer content and teacher skill. Basically, we talk a lot about teaching at the right level for kids, but there's also may apply to some teachers as well. Some of these teachers couldn't answer, didn't do very well. But on the other hand, most of the teachers did pretty well. So some of the teachers really weren't up to it. But okay, there, I just ran out of time. So I've got 2 more little quick slides here. And then there's weak motivation. Maybe the teachers,
Okay.
Go ahead. Okay, wrap it up. Okay. So anyways, make motivation. Again, we think that's part of the problem. It's not the main thing. And then, the kids were not really, at the level we wanted them to be at. So that could be part of the problem. But even the kids who were better didn't do well. In fact, the kids who were better scored worse in the treatment group than in the control group. Okay, so we have last 2 sort of what is it that we think is.
Paul?
Okay, I'll answer those questions. I'll get to
we can
this.
discuss this.
Okay, we can discuss. All right, thanks a lot. Okay.
Lindsay. Paul, do you still have the clicker, or did you leave it? Fun?
Hi, my name is Lindsay Brown. I am a senior research scientist at Global Ties for Education, and I'm going to be presenting on behalf of the ERIC Consortium, which is also FCDO funded. It's a multi-year, multi-country research program that is focused on education in emergencies in crisis-affected contexts. So that's largely the context in which we're going to be talking. I'm also not going to show you any experimental or quasi-experimental results. So just so you know that at the outset. So our program happens in 7 focal contexts. Today, I'm going to be talking primarily about research that comes from the country of Jordan. From the outset, what we really wanted as part of this consortium is that we work really closely with organizations that have really strong ties in the places where they're working. And so Common Heritage Foundation is who we partner with in Nigeria. And today we're going to be talking about work that we did in partnership with the Queen Rania Foundation. Okay, so one of our challenges from the outset is we of course we have this great consortium, we wanted to be able to talk about some research that happens across countries. So we needed some of the questions to be comparable across these contexts, but we also really wanted each research agenda to be focused on things that were really salient within those country contexts. And so we had this tension from the outset. How do we design a consortium so that we can speak to the countries across them and think about some of these contexts, but also how do we co-construct in ways that are specific to national priorities. So this was what we ultimately decided was our process for constructing the country research agendas. And we went looking for a tool that could help us sort of standardize this approach. How do we identify opportunities that are particularly high leverage for interventions in these contexts? And we came across the RISE program's tool for diagnosing systems of education. So I kind of assumed that people would be familiar with this tool before I came to this conference, but now I've updated that expectation. So if you're not familiar with the RISE diagnostic, it's looking at ways to diagnose systems, and we knew that it had been used in some stable contexts, and it's relatively new as a research tool. So we proceeded along 2 sort of parallel tracks for this research. One, we wanted to use it in the ways that we think it was thought of, to identify areas that are high leverage for interventions within a context, because those systems are misaligned, or components of those systems are misaligned in some way. But we also wanted to think about it as its suitability for use in conflict-affected contexts. So I'm going to talk about both of those things: its suitability for use in the context, or ways in which it might need to be adapted, and what are some incongruences that we found. So it looks at some major relationships within the education system: politics between citizens and the national government, compact between the government and ministries, management between ministries and schools and teachers, and voice and choice between citizens and schools and teachers. And then within each of those relationships, there are design elements of the education system. So really quickly: delegation, who tells that person what to do and how; finance, what kind of monetary resources do people have to achieve that goal; information, how do you determine if that person is reaching their goals or not; motivation, do those people want to reach their goals anyway; and support, what kind of assistance, usually non-monetary, are people given. So I want to also talk a little bit about the country of Jordan. So this is a relatively small, highly centralized country. It is a kingdom. There are about 10 million people, and nearly a third of them are refugees. A good proportion of those have been there for a long time. They're Palestinian, but nearly half of them have come since the Syrian war broke out in 2011. And unlike a lot of the Palestinians, these are in host communities. So if you're picturing a refugee camp, don't. They're living in cities in Jordan, definitely within particular regions, but they're living among everyone else in the communities in Jordan. This has put a ton of strain on public services, as you might imagine, chief among them the school system, because all of a sudden their population nearly doubled, because these kids are by and large integrated into the national school system there. So in a lot of places, what ended up happening is they, they have built some schools, but largely they've turned their existing schools into 2-shift systems. So the Jordanians go in the morning and the Syrians go, mostly Syrians, in the afternoon. Also, COVID, because of the worsening economic conditions, a lot of Jordanians were going to private schools in the system. It pushed even more kids into the public school system. So it became even more crowded than they were before this. I'm going to mostly skip this, but we ended up through a long process focusing on teacher management. So we have interviews and focus groups as our data here for this study. We talked to ministry officials in a bunch of different departments. We talked to supervisors who are intending to be coaches. Their role is shifting a little bit. We talked to school principals. We talked to a lot of teachers and some NGOs that are prevalent in the teacher management or training field. So this is an annex of the RISE diagnostic tool. We can talk about this later, but basically it's for each relationship, and then you have the design elements, and you look at whether there's alignment or not within these various components of the system. Okay, again, I'm going to talk about both policy and process. So one of the major things that we found is that there were huge policy incongruences between who's teaching the first shift and who's teaching the second shift and how those teachers are managed. There was almost no similarities. So the first shift teachers, these are your permanent civil servant teachers. They're managed nationally by the ministry, they're salaried, they have a rather new, but what people would consider pretty good, I think, teacher ranking system with a salary scale. And they have in-service training where they can increase their pay. By contrast, they have daily paid teachers who are teaching in the second shift. These are ad hoc management largely by regional ministry officials. They're on either month-to-month or semester contracts. They have nearly no job security. There's no differentiation in pay. And a lot of times they have to pay out of pocket for any training, or sometimes in this climate, an NGO sponsors their training. But when it's not a crisis context anymore, who knows whether that will happen. For people who are thinking, okay, contract teachers are everywhere, these are not community teachers. I want to be clear. These are fully trained and qualified teachers who are on a wait list to be civil servant teachers. In a lot of cases, because of people who have been grandfathered into the system, they are more trained, more qualified than the current civil servant workforce. Okay, so here's just some quotes. The morning teachers lock their rooms, and you have to see where we sit in a room size of 1 meter by 1 meter as if it was a graveyard. And then a second teacher chimes in, we should be lucky we have a share of the bathroom. They even wanted to lock the bathroom and would have done it if we had not objected. So there's a level of tension between these two groups that was really palpable when we did the focus groups. They feel like second-class citizens, even the teachers. We can talk about the students maybe later. One of the other things that was interesting is there has been this shift in evaluation roles. So they've been shifting the role of the supervisor to principals. And pedagogical supervisors feel like their authority has been usurped, and principals already feel like they had too much to do before. They don't really want this new responsibility. And there's a lack of resources for evaluation follow-up. So they have this new teacher ranking system, and they have this evaluation that's supposed to help determine their rank. But the people who maybe are the most likely candidates to be doing that evaluation system are not the ones who have been given that task. The ones who have been given it largely don't want it. And here's an exemplary quote. This is from a teacher. When a supervisor attended my lesson, he wanted me to split the class into groups, but the class is not qualified for that and there is not time. He went to the principal and told him that this teacher does not do groupings and so on. The principal told me in front of him not to worry and to let him talk, as the evaluation is based on the principal. Okay, I'm gonna skip this for time, unfortunately. Okay, the other thing is we wanted to think about how this RISE diagnostic worked in conflict-affected contexts. One of the ways we thought that it needed to be adapted is to add global actors, because it's currently primarily focused on national contexts, which makes a lot of sense, but global actors, donors, UN agencies, multilateral donors, they're so influential in areas of conflict and crisis that we really need to be examining this component of the system, because very often it's also adding a lot of complexity and lack of coordination. Also, the addition of an NGO and donor relationship, which isn't currently part of the RISE. Again, given the movement to integrate refugees into national school systems, this relationship is something that we think would be beneficial to add in these contexts. The other thing, and this is something I'm kind of interested in talking about with people who are working in systems and maybe have similar populations, is we were finding, even in our own consortium where we were interested in marginalized populations, this tension of course, there's always limited budget, limited time. We want to talk to the people who are determinant of the system. We're interested in working at scale with policy, but also the marginalized groups, a lot of them, they are experiencing things that happen on the edge of formal systems or even outside of formal systems. And so being able to sort of think about both of these groups at the same time, the people who are outside of the formal system and the people who are the determinants of that system, was a tension that we had a lot of research meetings about. How are we even going to decide on the sample and who's in it and who's out of it? And then the other thing is, in this diagnostic, one of the ideas is to look at the policies and the ways in which they are congruent or incongruent for certain things. But a lot of times what we were finding is a complete absence of policy. And so that's also something for us to consider, is where is there no policy for us to even look at? Okay. Next steps for us is we're continuing to look at interview and focus group data. These are preliminary results. They're some of the things that came up for us. And for us to think about expanding this to the ERIC consortium as a whole. Oops. The next step for us as a center is we're doing some new work on teacher systems in the context of Cameroon. This is a new context for me. If you've done work here, if you're familiar, I would love you to come talk to me about it. And also, I'm personally working on a framework for increased coherence of teacher professional development. I was super interested in that last presentation. I have a lot of thoughts about it. Working paper coming soon. Okay, thank you.
Over to James.
So thank you so much for the wildcard entry to present at RISE. This is my favorite conference. I'm going to present a paper that's co-authored with Glewwe Vasilius, who is in the room up there. You can ask him all the hard questions. And Martin Hitty, who is an undergraduate student who you should be looking for in the applications about 4 years from now. Incredible student. So over the last, I guess, 30 years or so, there's been a kind of a proliferation of administrative units around in many middle and low income countries. Many of them have essentially kind of followed public sector reforms to improve the management of service delivery. And in fact, this is why post hoc, I would like to sort of argue that in fact, what I'm talking about is really about, education input management, and in fact, teachers, because we think that's kind of the most important input. But unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to sort of have really compelling evidence to show you that, in fact, it's about that. Okay. And we essentially kind of going to exploit a pattern of district fragmentation in Tanzania between 2011 and 2019 in about 3 waves. Then some of the number of districts essentially kind of changed from about 130 districts in 2012 to about 184. So about a 50% increase. And there have been many studies of this question. Some of you might be familiar with the work by Sam Bazzi and Matthew Gajan, or Ricardo Dice in Brazil. So there's quite a lot of recent work on this fragmentation. And in some ways, it's ambiguous theoretically, sort of whether, in fact, fragmentation will actually improve outcomes, right? So there's some public economics theory that suggests that it should. Preferences are essentially kind of aligned. But on the other hand, essentially kind of local elites can essentially kind of capture resources and divert them. And then, of course, it suddenly increases public administration costs. And so everybody takes a hit when we essentially kind of create a new administrative unit. And that in some ways could essentially kind of affect essentially kind of outcomes. So I'm going to show you that, in fact, we don't see a lot of sort of big changes in the funding of the school system. But in fact, doesn't mean that, in fact, other domains might essentially kind of have been affected. Okay. So one, a political economy question was raised a little bit earlier about kind of the context here. Tanzania was started a process of decentralizing essentially kind of the administration of public services in 2001. But the central government was essentially kind of a little bit nervous about giving local governments actually the authority of hiring and firing essentially kind of local bureaucrats. And in fact, the central government actually sort of retains control over this. So education is essentially kind of administered by 2 agencies. The Ministry of Education sets standards and essentially kind of and policy, and the Ministry of Local Government actually implements these programs. And in some ways, Eusebius and I have written quite a few papers on essentially kind of the challenges that essentially kind of generates. Okay, but that so decentralization was, let's say, not complete. And I think Jean-Paul Faguet and others have actually written quite a lot about essentially kind of the promises of decentralization have not been fully realized, because in some ways the political economy has not allowed them to go as far. So let me show you a little bit about essentially kind of the pattern of the data and in some of the variation that we exploit. So this is in 2012. These are about 132 districts. In 2013, there's kind of the blue districts essentially kind of the splits that we observe. We observe this data in 2 different administrative data sets. The Ministry of Finance keeps information on essentially kind of where money is allocated. And we also essentially kind of observe this in the examinations data, where essentially kind of a school changes its district designation when that happens. In 2014, there's another sort of round of splits. So I'm only showing you the splits that happen in that particular year. And then in some ways, I'm sort of combining the splits for 2017 and 18. And so 3 waves of splits, but most of them you should sort of think of as being concentrated in the first 2 waves, so 2013 and 14. And ultimately, so what we do is effectively sort of combine this data with school location data. And I'm sort of going to say a little bit about why we actually need the school locations, because we actually sort of, in our trying to test for mechanisms, we are trying to look at how far a school is from the district headquarters. Okay, so we have some data. Those of you who will ask, so those who are familiar with the political science literature on district fragmentation will sort of think there's a political story. It's perhaps an electoral strategy. Perhaps it's essentially kind of a form of patronage. We've done the sums. There's not a lot in Tanzania. And in fact, there isn't actually sort of a very clear administrative essentially kind of rule that is used to actually sort of split districts. In the last set of splits, we actually do see some more competitive districts essentially kind of more likely to split, but the difference is not that big. Okay, so effectively what happens if we look at kind of a comparison between the split and never split districts, we actually see that in fact the split districts essentially kind of reduce in size quite dramatically from about 160 schools per district to essentially kind of about half of that. So what do you expect if you actually sort of split them down the middle? And so in some ways this is effectively the variation we look at. you can all pull out your essentially kind of identification enforcement knives. This is a diff and diff with essentially kind of staggered essentially kind of sort of treatment. So there are a lot of concerns about kind of dynamic treatment effects. There are a lot of concerns about heterogeneity. The districts that go early might have very different effects. Anyway, so we use the latest technology, and my younger co-authors have updated essentially kind of my literature. The paper that I knew the best was the Duflo paper of 2004, which is just how much can we trust differences. But this is apparently a new industry, and I'm told by your Quabus that we're using the latest technology. But we have some pretty limited data in some ways, so we can observe when a district gets split. So the key, I guess I have to point. So this little G sort of in some ways essentially kind of indicates which cohort of splits you're in. Because if we expect some heterogeneity in treatment effects, we actually sort of want to keep that. And we have, our outcomes are essentially kind of learning outcomes at the school level. So we observe in some ways all of the primary leaving examinations for all students in Tanzania between 2011 and 2019. And we can collapse essentially kind of that at the school level, standardize it, and essentially kind of take the aggregate at the district level. And we can also observe the number of candidates who are sitting for exams. Okay. So here's essentially kind of just the quick event study plot, in which essentially kind of each data point is a kind of a weighted average of essentially kind of the treatment effects across all of these splits. And what you can see is that, in fact, we do observe a small increase in test scores essentially after the split. The year -1 is essentially kind of the year, think of that as essentially kind of the year just before the split. And kind of that data point up there, the biggest data is about a 0.25 standard deviation sort of increase. On if you take the average, it's about 0.1, 0.09 standard deviations over time. But if you look at essentially kind of the test, the number of candidates who are sitting exams, in fact, we observe that one potential mechanism that's driving essentially kind of the gains is, in fact, that local government districts or school managers are essentially kind of perhaps reducing the number of kids who are taking the test. And this is not a new result. Quabus, Andy, and Andy Zeitlin and Isaac and Beatty have a paper which, in fact, sort of shows very similar results. And in fact, I'm going to argue with wave my hands a lot. That in fact, essentially kind of the timing of these splits coincides with an important reform that may explain essentially kind of the results we observe. Okay. So you might think, okay, well, so somebody's just getting rid of the kids who are essentially kind of weaker, and so generating essentially kind of artificial gains. We actually have some data from Uwezo, and many thanks to Julius and his team for actually sort of producing this data. This is a household-based essentially kind of test, ASER type test that was done in Tanzania. And we can observe essentially kind of the test scores of all kids who are essentially kind of tested at the household. And we also, what's nice about this survey is also it collects information on the public schools in the enumeration area that in fact was visited. So we can actually use that to actually sort of see what's happening over here. And the attention that we have, we have to correct for multiple hypothesis testing. And we do see essentially kind of some gains, a little bit smaller, but essentially kind of about the same magnitude in grades 3 and 4. And I'm going to explain why I think those things that's probably not that's not going to come from the high stakes. So there, I think school managers don't have incentives to reduce. They don't have incentives to essentially kind of manipulate essentially kind of who's in grades 3 and 4 and who's taking the test. So I actually think that those reflect essentially kind of potentially real gains. In terms of money, I think one concern, in some of the contexts has been that when you set up these new administrative units, it takes some time for money to flow to essentially kind of in the right places. We don't observe that in Tanzania, but I have to say our data here is pretty poor. We observe budget allocations. We don't observe essentially actual receipts. And so, that's an invitation that I'm happy to, got it. Yeah. And so whether we look at capitation grants or essentially kind of other essentially kind of discretionary expenditures, and all of these are actually sort of normed by the number of candidates. So one important feature, one piece of data that we don't have is essentially kind of annual school level data that would show us the population of students, teachers in a school. We can observe the number of candidates who sit an exam. And so we essentially kind of use that as the norm. The 2012, the pre-split number of candidates is essentially kind of the norm that we use. Okay. In terms of inputs that are essentially kind of the input we can observe at the school level using the household level data set. And I should also say this household level data set only looks at 2011 and 2015. So we don't actually look at splits in the 2017, 2018 time period. But we don't see any sort of really important sort of changes in inputs at the school level, where they essentially kind of textbooks, teachers, there's a small essentially kind of positive effect on teacher attendance, but it's essentially kind of not very precisely estimated. Okay. And then so now we're essentially going to come to the question of essentially, can we explain where all of these gains, the small gains, are coming from? And we essentially kind of try to test essentially two mechanisms: one about attention and monitoring, and then essentially kind of the other about essentially very similar, I guess, sort of underlying mechanism, but essentially kind of the location of where your headquarters are. So a split can essentially kind of take place in two ways. A split can be essentially kind of, we can lop off the urban sort of set of schools from the rural schools. So the urban place becomes a district, and the urban schools are essentially kind of, the rural schools become their own district. In those places, in some ways that kind of concentric arrangement, the location of the headquarters for the rural school remains essentially kind of in the urban areas. And we think that that may also be some bargaining between the bureaucrats and essentially kind of their higher ups. And in some places, a split actually essentially in a particularly rural district will split essentially kind of in two and create two new headquarters. And so we observe essentially kind of, a set of schools that essentially kind of, exist in split districts that essentially kind of have the same headquarters as they did before. So the distance to the headquarters doesn't really change. And in another set, essentially kind of, we have a new set of headquarters where the district actually, the distance to the headquarters actually will change. And we observe, in fact, that most of the gains that we actually sort of see in over this period, in fact, are concentrated in the new headquarters. Okay. And so the top panel in some ways sort of shows you that in some ways that's where most of the gains are. In the sample of schools where in fact they essentially kind of stayed in the same headquarters, we actually don't observe any gains. And it also looks like, especially in the new headquarters, that the further away you are from essentially kind of the old district headquarters, the larger essentially kind of the effect size. Okay, I'm running out of time. So I'll move on very quickly. So we do the same thing, looking at resources by sort of whether it's sort of new or same headquarters. And here we don't observe any effects. In some ways, kind of these are the two rows that you want to sort of focus on. And we think that in fact, a lot of the gains. Okay, so let me. So I have a minute and a half. Let me just say that we think that most of the gains are coming from schools either implementing a particular set of programs during this period between 2013 and 2015. There was a big reform in Tanzania referred to as the big results now, something that we studied quite a lot in under RISE. Under that program, there was a big emphasis on test scores at the end of the school cycle. So schools were ranked. That's the paper that Jacobus, Andy, and Isaac have. And at the lower end, they changed the curriculum. So essentially kind of schools were now teaching English after the third grade, and they're focusing on essentially kind of the foundational skills in the first two grades. Okay. Now, I don't have data to show you that the quality of implementation of these programs was better in essentially kind of the new headquarter districts versus the essentially kind of same headquarter districts. But in fact, local government leaders of education systems had to make pledges that were actually sort of going to improve learning outcomes. So one reason we see the decline in the candidates who are essentially a number of candidates who are sitting is in fact there was actually quite a lot of pressure. And we think that in fact this pressure actually sort of did translate into better implementation of some of the training programs for essentially kind of this reform. I don't have the data, but in some ways, I think that's the story that essentially kind of that is emerging. Here's my conclusion. We think there is some better monitoring, certainly beliefs about better monitoring, maybe not so much direct evidence of monitoring, but our evidence is, seeing all the teacher papers earlier today. I had a lot of data envy. We push the data we have as hard as we can, and that's where we are. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, James, and thanks to everyone for being very punctual. Could the rest of the speakers come down to the front, and we will take around about 25 minutes Q&A. Paul?
Coming.
I'm not going to enforce a kind of, we'll do it on teachers and then we'll do it on James's presentation. Just ask your question. So
I thought I was persuaded.
you're not going to ask James, right? But you are a specialist on teacher training. So, okay.
I won't even try for it.
Oh,
On there.
ouch.
To Paul, the framing that I would have had is, why do teacher training programs succeed at reducing student learning? Because you have a largest impact, it's an ITT, you have non-compliance, 10% significance. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons why the best students suffered the most. Maybe these teachers were now, they were taken out of the school, maybe they didn't learn enough, maybe this interactive work takes away from other work. So, I mean, I'd be curious, if you believe that there might have been a negative impact, I'd be curious to know why.
Mhm.
Wait, one there. Okay, I'm going to take one from here, and then if we have time, I'll sweep back round. Okay,
There you go. The question is for the presentation using the system diagnostic framework by RISE. I'm Parthajit from Central Square Foundation, India. We use the similar finding at the same diagnostic tool for studying the system of Punjab, a state. I think my question to you is it, that the kind of tool lends itself to a situation like an education in emergency, where you're forced to think like, probably non-system actors and people outside the system, even the donors, were relevant and should be included, because it's kind of in a time space, right? The emergency is not the steady state of the system, hopefully. So that's my question to you.
okay, from the middle.
That's a long way. Well, thank you. That's to Paul. So, I mean, I don't want to sound really terrible, but perhaps I should. Is that design, the way it sort of sits, and it's almost like a colonial teacher leadership project. I mean, I'm shocked. I'm really surprised at the way the design was there and the way foreign experts came to, really to do what was right. And then the teachers were sort of co-opted to sort of just align the curriculum. I'm just concerned at the entire way the design was made. And the fact that it was for grade 9 and 10, I mean, I'm just concerned because if the paucity of time was not even 2 weeks, but just 10 days without any support, anything. And then for high stake examinations, the way they take place, when they happen, I'm just concerned that, if we were to do a postmortem, what would we do that is different? And just yesterday in a community of practice RISE session, we were saying, what happens to these high branded projects? What is the possibility of any learning or longevity or sustainability? But, this is a design which is I think designed to fail and very colonial in its mindset so the question is, there's a lot of discussion on decolonizing. And I think definitely if RISE had one piece of work to do, it would look at some of these areas of where we seriously decolonize. And that's another language. If RISE has this diagnostics, I think we need to come up with another diagnostic, which is seriously looking at decolonizing these kind of constructs. And I mean, it was like really, so that's my question. And I would be really interested to know, did we really think about those aspects?
Fantastic, thank you. Take one more here and then we'll go through the answers from the
Hi, my question is for James. I'm wondering if with the new districts, with the new headquarters, were you able to observe any difference in the motivation or skills of the staff that were hired in there that might account for some of the differences in performance, or were they similar to the old ones?
Data. I know, so
Okay,
no.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right, so I think we've got 2 questions for Paul, 1 or 2 possibly for Lindsay, and 1 for James. Did anyone want to have a question for someone in this round? Okay, hand went up quickly there, and
I think I can talk loudly enough. For the district intervention, it was big results now was specifically about ranking schools within districts. So do you think this result is generalizable to fragmentation of districts outside of this context? Or is it specifically through this channel where now there are smaller districts with more competitive ranking than that smaller district?
okay, that was a question for James. Was there a question for Salman? No, okay, maybe in the next round. Right, so Paul, you had 2 and you started, so why don't we start with you?
Okay.
You need a reminder
So-
of questions, or are you? Okay.
I think I got it. Okay, so for the one about decolonizing, I should be clear that this teacher training was designed by the government, and we were brought in later to sort of evaluate it. We didn't have anything to do with design of the program. If you ask me, like, what could they do better? I didn't get to that on the slides because I ran out of time. I mean, the first thing I would say, don't do it during when school is in session, so they're pulling teachers out. Give the trainers a lot more advance time to prepare for the training and maybe train the trainers, which they didn't really do. And maybe, well, that's, I think there was one thing I don't remember. And then Jacobus, I think you were asking about what do we think really happened? We do think that the top students did actually, their scores went down. I don't think it's because the teachers were gone for 10 days. That doesn't seem like enough time. What we think is they actually did change their teaching to sort of more focus on students who were, in the middle or the bottom of the distribution. Well, we know that they slowed down like how far they got through the curriculum. And so the top students, when they would like rush through the curriculum, the top students could keep up and they would get to the end. But if they slowed it down, they never got to the end of the curriculum. And so the top students lost that. But we don't have really good data to really prove that. That's what we think happened.
Let's come to Lindsay next. A question here on contrast with Punjab, where the diagnostic was also used. And you might want to also chime in on Ella's point about whether we need the diagnostic for decolonization as well, if you want.
I don't know that I'm qualified to speak on diagnosing decolonization, but so I think in terms of whether or not we can use the rise in areas of conflict and crisis, I'm going to completely butcher this statistic, and I'm sure someone can correct me, but you said it's not the steady state of the system, and by and large, in these contexts, these crises are protracted. I mean, the Syrian war, it happened 9 years ago, and we're still, in this state. And I think the statistic is something like if you've been displaced for at least 3 years, the average that you're going to be displaced is 20 years or something. So I do think we need to transition into thinking about emergency contexts where we are looking at refugees and displaced persons being integrated into formal systems. And so what does that take? What does it look like to do that? How do you absorb that level of students? And so I think there's a lot in the diagnostic that we can use, but you're absolutely correct. And I talked about it a little bit in the presentation, that there is this tension between what the diagnostic is looking at in the formal system and all of these things that are happening outside of the formal system. And it was, again, a conversation that we were having a lot in our group is, how do you account for both of those things? I don't have any great answers, but if the question is essentially, is it useful to use in an area of conflict and crisis? I still think there's lots of useful things in the tool. And I think the idea of identifying areas of maximum potential for intervention. I think that frame for us when developing country agendas where we were looking at scale and policy was also really useful for us.
Great, thanks. James, 2 questions to you, one on motivation and one on mechanisms.
Yeah, so I think to your question about the quality of the bureaucrats who are managing the new districts, so we tried hard to get data on postings, and in fact we even did a survey of local government managers and a lot of the people who actually run the education office at the local government level in 2019. But many of those that essentially kind of moved around, and so we actually can observe who was actually sort of posted to a lot of the earlier splits in general. But that's something I think that would be important to look at. My sense is, given how Tanzania operates, that in some ways I think the posting would not work in the way that you might think. I actually think that in fact they might actually post better and stronger bureaucrats to essentially kind of the new districts rather than the other way around. But I certainly don't have the data to show it. But that's something that we certainly need to know essentially kind of exactly how the program was actually implemented to actually be able to explain the results. And then to your question about the timing of these splits and the results we observe, I think the short answer is I don't know if in fact it would generalize. Public economics theory would suggest that there should be some effects even beyond that, just from the fact that you reduce the scope of the management and administration effort that's required to deal with districts. But it's not just the ranking of schools, which in some ways the main result in the other paper that Davis and his co-authors have. But in fact, I think there were also essentially kind of changes at the lower level of the primary cycle, which I think were very different because of the timing of BRN. So I do think, yes, but I'm not so sure if in fact I could rule out essentially kind of that this wouldn't work in other places.
Great. I will come back to the audience in the room, but we've had a couple of questions come in online for Salman. So one is sort of a comment, and maybe you can reflect on it, about the existence of the National Reading Programme and whether there were interactions between that and your intervention. And secondly, this is music to Noam's ears, I'm sure, on implementation. What was the cost of the training and opportunity cost of doing that instead of the remedial classes directly?
Very good questions. I think I'll start with the costing. So we did some analysis and it's in the paper on per unit cost. It comes down to about $40 per student. So about 0.1 standard deviation, 0.17 standard deviation gain is equivalent of $100 of spending per student, which is not high. But I will agree to the fact that if you know a priori that remedial classes is the solution in this particular context, you would go with the remedial classes. But most of these interventions are designed at a time when you don't have all the information. So knowing what has happened, because that's a binding constraint, that they are teaching about 2 hours. So the head teachers will respond to that constraint to resolve it by expanding the time, by giving more frequency to the remedial classes, and it's more concrete and easily actionable as well.
Great. Let's open it up again to the floor. I did see some more hands go back up. Kanata, do you want to start? And then Barbara, we'll come to you if there's time, but people who haven't already asked questions there. Kanata at the back.
So my question is for Salman. It's interesting to see your study because it came out at the same time that a systematic review of a management training study came out as well. And one of the things that they say that affects the successful implementation is slow take-up. I was looking at your paper, and you say in your paper that 798 of 800 schools participated in the training, which is amazing. I'd like to see how you achieve that.
Question down here. No, the lady behind you.
For the study that was done about Nepal, I was wondering, it was interesting that you didn't mention when you talked about what could be done better, instructional coaching and more ongoing support. And I'm sitting next to the head of Dignitas, which does great work in that area. So that seems like if you have a chance when you're summarizing what could be done better. I think that could be one to mention. But I also wondered, did you have a chance to actually feed back your results to the government? And did they listen to you? And do you know what's going on now in terms of whether they're actually evolving their model? Because I would hope so. Or are there NGOs that are working on trying to support the government to learn from what you found?
There was a question over here that I didn't take from the first round. So I'm just trying to make you run as much as
And we're the wrong shoes.
Thanks. My question is to Paul first, and help me help one system improve. Out of that study, if I backed away from data that you have presented here and took a simple layman question, very similar to my colleague there who said, did you feed back to the government? Now let me take complete layman position as government, say, and ask you, was this program a design failure? Was it a systemic failure? Was it something that was as a consequence of what I call the Donna lethargy, where people just expect, doesn't matter, even if we get it wrong, one very lenient donor will always come and pick up the pieces. What did you see about that? And my second question is to James. Sorry to ask. I'm a bit James.
We'll just stop there. I don't want to, if I establish a norm that you can answer to, I know where it's going to head. So we'll just take one. Was there another question somewhere else? Okay, I was trying to look for people who haven't either spoken or answered the question before, but Gregory, go for it.
I just have a quick question. I have a quick question for Paul. What role do you think incentives or lack of incentives for teachers to participate in the program had? Because a lot of places have career path incentives. You can get points on your career path. Do you think those play any kind of role to motivate teachers to be more engaged in the training, or is it just a design failure?
Okay, Barbara, I'll take yours. If it's not for Paul, is it for Paul?
Yeah, me too. I agree with that.
It's not for Paul? Okay, good.
Okay, thanks. The research that exists on principal quality and impact on school performance basically shows two channels: managing the teacher cohort in the school and creating a school culture where teachers learn from each other. In both of these contexts, how did that play out? Was the training oriented to that kind of, principal expertise? And in Tanzania, what was the impact of these splits? I mean, you can imagine a teacher who's been working under one district administration may have the same language, et cetera, and all of a sudden have a different boss. And also, do those new bosses have any have any power over the teacher allocations?
Great. Okay, so by my count, Paul, you've got 3. So we'll start with you.
3 questions for me?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I remember some of them. So I agree that one of the things I should have said that I forgot at the end was follow-up is very important for the teacher training. There was really no follow-up going on at all. And it could be in the form of coaching or just having people go back. I have another paper on coaching, and one of my co-authors is here in Peru. And the thing about coaching, at least in Peru, is it's very expensive. So that was it. And I think a couple of people asked, like, what was the, how did we feed back to the government? It was actually really a mess because they completely changed. They did this federalization of the entire government structure. So these teacher training centers were disbanded. It was a very central structure before, and then they divided the country into 7 regions and moved things out. And the 2 people we interacted with the most got new jobs. So they were like just gone. We can't get in touch with them. So yeah, it was like, we don't even know who to do. Actually, my co-author, Uttam, probably could say better than me, like how it works, but it didn't work. And so I think it was partly a design failure, having the teachers come during the school year instead of out of time. That was one example of a design problem. But I think partly systemic, not having much incentives. Yeah, that was the last comment. The incentives, I don't think there are big incentives that, if the teacher doesn't show up for the training or the teacher doesn't really make use of the training, that they're going to lose anything. I mean, they get paid a little bit more, or a little bit goes into their, annual reviews, to get a promotion or something like this, but it's not a big deal. So it kind of has to be almost the way it's set up now, that there aren't big incentives. So it has to be sort of their own motivation, which I think some of the teachers are quite motivated, but they also struggle a lot with, in this case, the kids being behind when they already come in the grades 9 and 10.
Okay, great. Let's go to Salman. First, a very simple question. How did you get effectively 100% take up? And then the point from Barbara about the two different ways in which you might try and approach improving management.
I think on the implementation fidelity, I didn't give like the overview that this is part of like Malawi Education Sector Improvement Project. So that's basically funded by the Global Partnership for Education. So $45 million grant for system reforms. So this is one of the interventions that was implemented. I think what's looking at like Paul's presentation and like Malawi's context, I think the basic difference is how much time you spend in the context designing the intervention. Are all the stakeholders involved and they converge in terms of the implementation fidelity or not? And then like the government makes them accountable in terms of bringing them for the training. So once the schools were picked as part of the process, it was basically, they thought that it was a very good thing for them to have on their resume or as a reference to go to these training programs. So how the ministry kind of like inculcates that kind of like attitude among the head teachers, I think that makes a difference in terms of the fidelity. And on Barbara's point, in terms of the channels, I think it's the local expertise. So if you look at the training program, it's a consortium. So it's the government of Malawi, it's a research university in Malawi, and then there is an international firm which is coming in. So how you codify new techniques and behaviors while listening to the people on the ground, I think that makes a difference in terms of bringing the expertise in this area. But at the same time, we didn't see any impacts on the culture side, which we thought was like, we should be able to move a needle on that.
James, did you want to respond to Barbara's prompt as well?
Yes, as best I can. So I agree with you that in fact, one potential channel is having a new manager who actually cares about learning outcomes. I think the key feature of this big results now was kind of a shift from let's just worry about inputs to we really want our kids to learn, and we're going to essentially kind of make results of test scores transparent, and we're going to essentially kind of put a lot of pressure on. There's a traffic light system. If you're a red school, you get more resources. And so we think some of the remote schools are essentially kind of benefiting from the fact that essentially kind of there is a little bit more attention that they're getting. But we don't observe essentially, and these LGA managers actually do have the ability to actually allocate teachers, but we don't actually observe year by year essentially kind of teacher allocations. We use the survey data, which essentially kind of, we can't geolocate essentially kind of exactly where they're. We know what district they're in, but we essentially kind of can't geolocate and link to the school. And so, yes, there are a lot of interesting mechanisms that we would like to test, but are unable to.
Okay, and Lindsay asked to make a response to Paul's comment, and then I'm going to come back with one more question. So think what that killer question could be. Okay.
I'm a teacher trainer at heart. And so I am so interested in the study, but I also think realistically, if the issue were compliance, there likely would have been a treatment on the treated effect. Coaching is expensive, but when done well, it can also be cost effective, and nothing's more expensive than failed programs. We've all had them, so that's not a criticism, but just a reminder. One of the results of our study that I didn't have time to talk about was how these supervisors who are intended to be coaches they have very little training in their approach for how they're supposed to observe and give feedback to teachers. And this has been something that I've seen in many of the contexts where we worked. We have this low-hanging fruit. They're already on the payroll. They already have a position. Yes, ratios are high. There's other issues, but we have this workforce that is being underutilized in the teacher professionalization sort of trajectory that we could really capacitate to do some of this work in so many countries. I just wanted to give a...
Okay, if you can ask a question in 10, 20 seconds, I'll come to you. Michelle, I know, I trust you. Go on.
Thanks. Yeah, just a question for Paul on actually your mixed methods approach, because I think we can see that because you had that qualitative data, it has lent to a much maybe richer conversation about those findings than if it had just been here's another teacher training program that failed. So just wondering if you could speak for whatever 1 minute that's left, but challenges, how do you determine what questions to ask? Were there questions that you wish you had asked that you didn't in that kind of qualitative component? And any thoughts that would lend to people doing quantitative studies that want to maybe add that type of component?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is find somebody who's good at qualitative studies, which is not me. So we did hire a local person who turned out to be very good and talk to other people about it. So that's my kind of quick thing. The other thing I just was reminded of is when we presented our results to the Ministry of Education people, we were a little worried that they would be upset with us because we were saying, hey, your program is really bad. So we kind of softened it a little bit. But they didn't actually seem to be worried, and they said, yeah, we didn't think this program was very good. And so we're not very surprised that it failed, and no hard feelings or anything. I don't know. Yeah, that's maybe Uttam, my co-author, could ask you. Well, the Asian Development Bank, paid for it. And Uttam said, is anybody from the Asian Development Bank here? He said they just shell out the money and they don't care if it works or not.
Okay, so thanks everyone for a really, really fruitful session, really great discussion. Thanks for all of your questions. I'm just going to close by noting, it is obvious from the interest in this that supporting teachers is hugely important, but it's really hard to get it right. We kind of knew that from studies by Dave and other people like that, but I think what's coming out really clearly is we need to know more than there's just mixed impacts. We need to know why there are mixed impacts. We need to do the qualitative work. We need to do the studies of implementation, which leads really nicely into a session that we're going to have this afternoon. So thanks to everybody, and please go and enjoy your lunch. I very much hope that there's a queuing system, that we're not all queuing together. And we're going to be back promptly for 1:30 when Julius is going to have a session on foundational learning. So, thank you.